Hey guys, it is Wingy here and welcome to a brand new video on my channel. I say brand new, it's more of an updated version of a video I did pretty much at the very start of my channel. So you may have seen they're relatively popular videos on my channel. In fact, I think the classic best and worst are my top 2 videos on my channel now. However, those lists are outdated. Like, they're 4 years old. I don't even agree with those lists now. Like, when it comes down to it, my opinions have changed. Like, certain stories that I put on those lists, I either think better of now, I think less of now, and there's other stories that I would put on that list instead. And that's what we're going to do. I'm going to redo my top 10 best and worst of both the classic era and also the modern era. Obviously, there's been more stories now with the modern era. However, I'm going to just stick to the classics for this part. As you can tell from the title and the thumbnail of this video, I'm going to be talking about my top 10 personal best classic era stories. Now, a little caveat with this, some of the choices on this list are still going to be on the list from the previous one. They might have moved up a place or moved down a place, they might even be in the same place, who's to say? But for me, this is where I'm currently at with a 2021 eye. Bringing it in at number 10 is a story that was nowhere near my top 10 best list back in the day, or at least when I did my previous one, and that's Resurrection of the Daleks. And I know that seems like a little bit of a left field choice, but I've really come to love this story in the last few years. Listen, when it comes to like my favourite Fifth Doctor stories, I have spoken about them a lot, so I'm not going to go into masses of detail. However, if you want to hear me talk more in depth about this, and I'm assuming you can guess the other two, I did do my top 3 personal best of the Fifth Doctor era, so go and check that video out for a little bit more detail. However, what I will say is, this has really gone up in my estimations because it is a story that I find myself constantly coming back to. I don't know what it is, and given the nature and how dark this story actually is, weirdly, it's become a comfort story for me. And I think when you do a video like this, when you're talking about your top 10 favourites or what you think are the top 10 best, I think that is a crucial factor, rewatchability, and the fact that you feel like you constantly can keep going back to it and you still enjoy it as much as you did the previous time. That for me is Resurrection all over. I love the brutality of the Daleks, I love the brutality of the story, I love Tegan's exit, and I really like Peter Davison's performance. Is it a little bit convoluted? Yeah, but after multiple watches, I do appreciate it for what it is. So for me, Resurrection, it had to be on my list now. Another story that was not on my previous list from a few years ago was The War Machines. Now for me, The War Machines has slowly become my favourite First Doctor story. I don't know why, I don't know how, I just found myself really enjoying this story. I think for me, the reason why I've started to appreciate it a lot more is because I really like the plot of it. I really like the fact that there is this artificial intelligence almost that is trying to take over the world and the Doctor has to stop it. It's not exactly the most original story. We've seen stuff like it subsequently, but that doesn't stop me appreciating this one from 1965. The actual design of the War Machines themselves I think is great, and there's some really cool moments in this story. I actually quite like when Dodo is sort of a traitor or is under the influence of the War Machines. I thought that was quite a nice angle to go with. This story also introduces us to Ben and Polly, not necessarily my favourite companions, but I do quite like their introduction. I also like the fact that at the beginning of the story, the Doctor himself sort of just has a feeling that something isn't quite right. It's just a subtle moment, it's fairly early on, but stuff like that I really wish we'd see more of in Doctor Who. Like, the Doctor just knows that something is gonna go wrong or something bad is happening. I don't think that this is a story that loads of people would talk about or that loads of people would say is like one of the best stories ever, but again, in terms of the First Doctor, this is probably the story now that I would come back to the most. A story that was most definitely on my previous list and is most definitely on this list now is Remembrance of the Daleks. Again, do I need to say much about Remembrance? Like, people pretty much know the gist of Remembrance of the Daleks now. It is a fantastic story and it is probably, in my opinion, Sylvester's best. I really like that we are set in 1963, like this should have been Doctor Who's 25th anniversary. Never mind Silver Nemesis, because that was shit. This one, just, it's so fan servicey, but it doesn't get bogged down with it. It's still a very, very strong story in its own right. I love seeing the Dalek Civil War and the Imperial Daleks, the white and gold, they are so beautiful. And I love the location work at Coal Hill School. I love the Dalek spaceship as well. I think that looks incredible. From a plot perspective, the Doctor is so dark and manipulative, and you don't really see that until the very end of the story, but when you know what happens at the end and then you rewatch the story, you see it through a totally different lens. The fact that he just, you know, tricks the Daleks into blowing themselves up, a lot of people would take issue with that, but given the context of the story, I don't, and I really like the way that that moment is handled. We have a great cast in this story as well, and all the side characters, none of them feel underdeveloped, none of them feel like they're overbearing in the story. It's almost like the Doctor is playing chess. It's almost like the script is as well. With the characters, they're using their pieces to the best of their ability. They're not trying to get more out of a pawn than they need to. Not necessarily my best analogy, but if you've watched my channel since I originally did these videos, I've never been good at them. Either way, Remembrance of the Daleks, it is a standout story from 1988 and just a standout story in general. In at number 7 is another survivor from the previous one, which is The Invasion. Now, I used to say that The Invasion was my favourite Patrick Troughton story, and do I still stand by that? Probably not. You will find out the other one later if you don't already know. You probably might already know at this point if you have been watching my videos. Either way, The Invasion. I've said this countless times and I'm sorry for repeating myself, but I will again. This story really surprised me because it's an 8-part story, and yet even as a kid who could not focus on a fucking thing, I was able to just sit through this entire long story and love every second of it. I love the imagery in this story, which has gone on to subsequently become iconic imagery in Doctor Who. The Cybermen in the sewers bursting out of them, and you see them outside St. Paul's Cathedral. I love when the Cyberman just bursts out of the cocoon at the end of, I think it's part 4. I love Tobias Vaughan as a villain, and he's arguably, maybe, probably the best human villain that Doctor Who has ever had. Patrick Troughton in this story I think is glorious. I love his performance where it goes from witty and mischievous to serious. Like, Troughton is an all-rounder in this story, like he is in pretty much all of them anyway. The Cybermen designs I'm not in love with, but I do really like them, and I think if on paper you were to say to someone, well, this is a Cyberman story, but they're only in it sort of halfway through, usually you'd be like, okay, that's fine. When you realise this is an 8-part story, 4 parts more or less without the Cybermen, you'd think, oh Jesus. But the story hooks you. You don't even need Cybermen to be invested into the story, so when they finally do arrive, the story feels like it's earned it. Of course, this would be the template for the Pertwee era, and it just goes to show how successful that would be, because straight away, this was a success. Speaking of the Pertwee era, we are going with Spearhead from Space. In terms of the classic era, my favourite. Oh, no, it's not. No, it's not. Oh, I nearly slipped up then. In terms of the classic era, it is one of my favourite post-regeneration stories. I just feel like this introduced the Pertwee era to perfection. I don't have any issues with this story, really. I think the pacing is fantastic. I love the film quality throughout the entire story, because obviously they filmed it all on film. I love how Pertwee is as the Doctor. Yes, it does that thing that somewhat annoys me, where it's like the Doctor's out of action and is still sort of cooking, but when he does join the story, which doesn't take that long admittedly, you automatically just fall in love with him. Like, Jon Pertwee's charisma and his attitude and the way that he delivers his lines, you just get sucked in straight away. Obviously characters like Lethbridge Stewart we have met before previously in the Troughton era, obviously. The new dynamic, it still feels like the old one, but there's a freshness to it. And you can't wait to see what else this relationship has in store, and trust me, it takes some twists and turns. The Autons / the Nestine Consciousness, I think are a fantastic villain. I think the ending is a little bit sloppy with the weird octopus thing choking Jon Pertwee. Apart from that, I don't have an issue with this story, I just love it. There's some really chilling moments in this as well, particularly where there's that guy who's in the tent and then the Auton just breaks in and kills him. I love that scene. I think it's awesome. I'm pretty sure it was on my list a few years ago, and yeah, it's definitely not changed. Whether it's moved up or down a few places, I can't actually remember, but yeah, Spearhead, it's got to be on it. Now we are in the top 5, and I know for a fact that these are relatively similar, but a few differences in terms of their place. In at number 5 is City of Death. Just checking the list. Yes, it is City of Death. Now, I'm pretty sure I had this higher last time around, and to be honest, I don't really like that I've moved it down, because it suggests that I don't like it as much as I once did a few years ago. But the truth of the matter is, I absolutely do. Like, if you're in the top 5, you're pretty fucking good. City of Death, for me, will always be a comfort Doctor Who story. Like, this, for me, is borderline perfect. What I love about it is, first, the location setting in Paris, the music, I love the villain, I love Tom's performance, I love Lalla Ward's performance, I love the guest cast. Like, For me, this is a very well-rounded Doctor Who story in terms of there aren't many elements that I would want to take out or try and improve upon. I think characters like Duggan, characters like Count Scarleone, I think characters like the Professor or Catherine Shell's character, but I can't think what she's called now, that's really annoying. Lady Scarleone? Either way, I love them all. This story is one of the rare instances in the Douglas Adams era of Doctor Who where they managed to balance the humour perfectly with what's going on with the story. A lot of the times in the latter half of the Tom Baker era, barring obviously season 18, they would go a little bit too far with the humour to the point where it was distracting. And I do think that this story definitely has some of the biggest and most outlandish gags or jokes, but I think it's subtle with them. I think it suits the story because when you think about it, this is actually quite a silly story, but it does mess around with time travel, which is another thing about Doctor Who that I love when it does. You'd be surprised how little Doctor Who does actually mess around with time travel. Now, Tom is my favourite Doctor, no surprises there. I love how goofy and wacky he is, but yet how so much in control he still is. He will just turn and drop the act and be like, okay, I'm the Doctor, let's actually deal with this in a serious way. I think Tom is flawless. This is arguably Tom's best performance as the Doctor. Number 4 is another story that I feel may or may not have gone down a place, I'm not sure, but it's Earthshock. Again, I speak about Earthshock all the time. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it, but it's just a fucking great Cyberman story, isn't it? Actually, no. I think the annoying thing about Earthshock now is that it didn't technically have to be a Cyberman story. You could lift them out and put in any other villain and the story still works. But I just love these Cybermen and I love their entire plot and their plan and everything like that and the Doctor's reaction. And obviously at the end of this story, a companion dies, which is a big deal. It isn't the week after in Time Flight, but at the time it feels like a big deal. I love the claustrophobic atmosphere of this entire story. Like, as soon as you arrive, you're in these caves. It's very dark, it's very dank, it feels very closed off. It feels like there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. And then you go onto this space station or spaceship, or cargo ship. Yeah, it's a cargo ship, we'll go with that one. When you get on there, it's not quite the same as the caves, but it's not too dissimilar. It still does feel like they're trapped. It does remind me in a way a little bit of Alien in terms of it does feel like this closed off ship and anything can happen from anywhere. Obviously it's not quite the same, but you kind of get what I'm going for. I just love the fact that the Cybermen were hiding on this ship and they were waiting to pounce. And again, this is another story where Doctor Who plays around with time travel, sort of, because this cargo ship was actually the reason why the dinosaurs got wiped out. It wasn't a meteor. That I think is really clever. I love that. You could say this story is excellent. Do you know, you ever say something and you think, oh man, this is so cool, and then when you say it out loud you think, oh Jesus, why did you do that? That's exactly what I just did, but I'm leaving it in because I care. Right, we've reached the top 3. Now we have a new entry. Oh, it's like I'm doing the top 40. Well, it is around Christmas time, so it's like the top 10 Christmas chart of Doctor Who, except it's not because none of these are Christmas specials. Get to the point, Alex. So, number 3 is Power of the Daleks. If you'd have said to me 4 years ago that in a few years Power of the Daleks would be my top 3 or the start of the top 3, I wouldn't have believed you. And the thing is, I'm surprised myself now still that it's here, but at the end of the day this is a story that I didn't really give a fair chance to. I looked at the first animation and because it wasn't perfect, it kind of annoyed me to the point where I didn't actually appreciate the story itself. When we got the special edition release, I started to really love this story. This is the one story that I think I've said in videos and Q&As before that if we could find any of the missing stories, I would pick this one. Yes, we have an animation, 2 of them now. I don't know, I'd want to see Troughton's first performance because just hearing it and seeing what they could do with the animation, I think it'd elevate it even more. This is for me the epitome of why I love the Daleks. Like, they are scheming, they are nasty, they are manipulative, they are selfish, and I love it. I think it does a great thing as well because obviously the Doctor knows, obviously we as the audience know, but nobody else in the story really knows what the Daleks are about, so they're just like, no, like, why would these people or these creatures, why would they go against us? Why would they just use us for their own gain? That doesn't make any sense. See, he even says he wants to be our servant multiple times. shouting over the Doctor, the one person they are trying to silence. No suspicion there whatsoever, really. I love Lesterson. I think the descent of Lesterson from this sort of budding scientist to absolute train wreck, I think is probably one of my favourite aspects of this story. I just love the slow decline. And the thing is, you don't even see it coming because it happens so naturally. It's not just like 1 minute he's fine, the next minute he's insane. It is just like throughout the story, he gradually just breaks down. I love some of the elements of this story with the Daleks as well, in terms of the fact that, you know, they do pretend to be the good guys or pretend to try and help out these people, but I also love where you see them create the new batch of Daleks, and that cliffhanger where you just see countless numbers of them just coming off the conveyor belt and wandering around, and you think, shit, we may have our work cut out for us here. All around, just a fantastic story. And for a Doctor's first story, particularly the first of the new Doctor's first stories, this works so well. I mean, at the time it probably had to, because they had to get this right, and my god did they just fucking knock it out of the park. So 2 stories left. If you know me at all and you have heard anything that I've said over the years on my channel, you will not be surprised by either of these 2. In at number 2 is Caves of Androzani. I mean, it had to be. I still love Caves of Androzani. Like, I know some people recently I've seen have said that, you know, it's really overrated, it's actually quite dull, doesn't really start doing anything, people only like it for the moments. I've seen all of these things. However, my personal opinion, this is a fantastic Doctor Who story, and for me, the best regeneration story, but also, in terms of the characterization, one of the best of the Doctor, or at least the core fundamentals of the Doctor. That's not to say that Peter Davison doesn't put in a good performance, because my god does he, it's probably his best. But I just love how heroic and selfless the Doctor is in this story, and I know people could say, but he's like that in every story. The thing is with this, it feels more than that, because the context of this story is he's saving the life of a woman who he barely knows. Now, I know Big Finish did fill in the gaps and they did have more adventures with Perry and Peter Davison, but for me, I just treat it as Planet of Fire straight into Caves, because that just makes Caves better. I just love how everybody in this story is an arsehole, apart from the Doctor and Perry. Everybody is out for their own gain, everybody gets what they deserve, and throughout the entire story, no one really cares about the Doctor, no one's really on his side or Perry's side. They're just sort of like, oh, that's unfortunate, anyway, we need to do this. Sharaz Jek as a villain, I think is fantastically done, because he is one of those villains that, yeah, he's a bad person, and yeah, what he's doing isn't right, but you do feel sympathy for him. Like, when you hear about his backstory and what happened to him, there is a little element to you that thinks, I kind of want to give him a hug. If you were, you know, a lookalike of Nicola Bryant, or you were Nicola Bryant, I would maybe stay clear, because he's clearly a little bit creepy, but, you know, apart from that sort of creepiness, you do sort of understand where he's coming from a little bit. Not all the time, but sometimes, occasionally, the odd moment. You get what I mean. I love how dark this story is. I love the pacing of it. I love how it's directed as well. I think Graham Harper did something really unique with this, especially for the classic era. Modern era, this style of directing is par for the course. In the classic era, really not. And some of the cliffhangers as well, some of the best in the show. Easy. And then, of course, if you haven't guessed already, which I'm assuming you have, it's Genesis of the Daleks. I couldn't not include Genesis, and I think for me, I have to say now that this is objectively, in my mind, which is subjective then, isn't it, you arsehole? But for me, in my mind, Genesis is the greatest Doctor Who story ever. And the thing is, it's not even necessarily just because of the story itself, it's what this story has gone on to do and what this story represents. It is, in my opinion, the most iconic Doctor Who story with the most iconic moments and imagery. I think the problem is, with a story like this, you see the title Genesis of the Daleks, and yes, the title is correct. However, this is not a Dalek story. This is a Davros story. This is a story about the Khaleds, and about Skaro, and about the war, and about preventing the Daleks from even happening. Do the Daleks appear in this story? Absolutely. Do they have some good moments in this story? Oh yeah, they absolutely do. But if you treat it just as a Dalek story, it doesn't quite work. But if you look at it as the bigger picture, this is phenomenal from an acting point of view, from a plot point of view, from just an oh, just how dark it is in places. Like, I forget how dark some of these moments actually are. I love the fact that the Doctor and Harry get separated from Sarah and they both have their own separate thing to deal with. And what I love as well is that balance. Like, in previous appearances of the Daleks and the Thals together, or at least the Khalids and the Thals, you get this idea that the Thals are the good guys, the Khalids / Daleks are the bad guys. Turns out that really isn't the case. This is war that you're dealing with. The bad guy is whoever's your opponent. You're always the good guy. There's no sort of grey area. And I love the fact that Genesis, or at least Terry Nation when he was writing it, was brave enough to be like, actually there is a grey area there. Like, just because the Khaled / Daleks over here, just because these are bastards, that doesn't mean that the Thals are perfect either, because they're not. They do some fucked up shit. Michael Wisher as Davros, I think, gives one of the finest performances of any villain in Doctor Who's history. I love his scenes with Tom Baker, and I love how the more and more insane he goes, the more and more over the top he goes, the more and more he himself becomes a Dalek. However, not enough of a Dalek, because by the end of the story they still see him as too different and they kill him anyway. Nyder, I forgot to mention Nyder as a supporting villain. He's great. I love Nyder. I mean, not all the Thals are assholes, but you know, is Severin? No, Severin's a Muto. You've got some of them that are quite nice, some of them that are manipulative assholes, some of them that are just, you know, assholes in general. Like I said before with City of Death, you could argue that that was Tom's best performance. You can make a case for this as well. The Do I Have the Right speech? Phenomenal. So that is my updated version of my top 10 best of the classic era. In the comments below though, guys, because I know no one's going to agree. And I know there's going to be some choices on here that people go, fucking really? In the comments, like I said, let me know what your top 10 would be. And considering that I did this a few years ago, has your opinion changed? Like, is there any stories a few years ago that you thought, nah, not really, whereas now, oh my god, I love it? Or a story a few years ago that you really loved, now you're like, meh, not feeling it as much. Whatever it is, let me know down below. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure you leave a like on it, subscribe for more. Social media and Patreon links are in the description as always, so if you would follow me on any of those things, I'd absolutely love you forever. But till next time, guys, you take care of yourselves. Goodbye.